All right, so like I said at the end of the previous video, we're going to just take a look at a little more detail when it comes to some of this lower respiratory tract anatomy. So the trachea, often referred to as your windpipe, rigid tube because it has cartilaginous rings. So this dark purple here represents the cartilage. It's about 12 centimeters long, or 4.5 inches, and about 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch in diameter. It lies anterior to the other tube, right? You get two tubes, one for air, one for food. So it lies in front of the esophagus. It has about 16 to 20 pieces of cartilage. They're made up of hyaline cartilage. They're basically kind of shaped like the letter C, where they're not, a complete ring around the entire circumference. The basically kind of the opening faces the esophagus. And what that allows is when this esophagus has to expand, right? When you're swallowing food, that allows that esophagus to expand a little bit. So it'll expand and kind of push into the trachea and allow that, what we call a bolus of food to travel down that esophagus. All right. So it kind of allows the expansion of the esophagus during swallowing. It's going to fork at what we call the sternal angle. If you recall, the sternal angle is a part of your sternum that lines up about with your second rib. So that's where the trachea will fork or split into the two main bronchi. Again, at the bottom of the trachea, there's an area called the carina. It's going to direct the air into either the right or left primary bronchi. This area is also very sensitive, so it can trigger a cough reflex. If there's any kind of particulates, dust that gets down to the bottom of that trachea, it can trigger that cough. Looking at some of these other pictures here, this is a transverse section. So here's the lumen of the trachea. This is the front of the trachea. There's that esophagus behind the trachea. You'll notice here's a nice drawing of the lining of the trachea. It has cilia that's going to move the mucus. So when things get stuck and captured in this mucus, the little ciliated cells can move that mucus up, and eventually most of that mucus you end up swallowing. But at least you're trapping particulates and pathogens and keeping them out of your lungs. So it kind of acts as almost like an escalator. It keeps moving this mucus up as it captures particulates. This is just another picture. I like this one because all these different colors represent different segments. So this again would be the trachea. These are the two main or primary bronchi. You see them start to divide into secondary bronchi. And then wherever you have a different color represents a different segment. So this is just another kind of drawing showing this branching of the respiratory tract. So trachea goes to a main bronchus, which goes to lobar bronchi, which goes to segmental bronchi, which will then branch into smaller bronchioles, eventually terminal bronchioles, and then finally this respiratory zone. All this little purple stuff is cartilage. So again, you got a lot of cartilage all the way until you get to the bronchioles. That's where there's no more cartilage. So over here I have some important trends. So the epithelial tissue changes a little bit. So it's going to have a lot of ciliated cells in the upper airways, like your throat, your trachea. When you get down to these alveoli, that wall of the alveolus is a simple squamous. So you could do gas exchange to very flat, thin cells. So this lining of the respiratory tract does change quite a bit as you go down. The cartilage also changes, so notice a lot of cartilage in the upper airways here, and then it goes away at the bronchioles. All right, so very important, those bronchioles, you don't want cartilage because that's going to restrict the ability to dilate and constrict the bronchioles. That's a huge way you can bring either more air or less air into the alveoli, is by performing either bronchodilation or bronchoconstriction. So that's using the smooth muscle of the bronchioles to regulate the size or diameter of your airways down here. So if you know someone or you yourself use a bronchodilator, it's not dilating the trachea or these larger airways. It's dilating these smaller bronchioles, and that'll allow you to get more air into those respiratory zones. Let's take a look at a little more detail of the lungs. So this is kind of the gross anatomy of the lungs. They all have an apex. So I should say they each have an apex on top. That's kind of this point up here. They have a hilum or root. That's this attachment site here. That's where everything goes in or out of a lung. So you're going to have blood vessels in there, right? You're going to have pulmonary arteries, pulmonary veins. You're going to have those primary bronchi going into that lung. You're going to have lymphatics. You'll have nerves there. Everything that has to go in or out of that lung is at this area called the hilum. You've got fissures. Fissures are what divide it into lobes. So this right lung, you can either look at this here or this here. This is a medial view. This is a lateral view. But the right lung has 3 lobes. So if you have 3 lobes, you're going to have 2 fissures. The fissures are what divide the lung up. So this has what's called a horizontal fissure and an oblique fissure. So 2 fissures will divide a lung into 3 lobes. The left lung has 1 fissure. It's an oblique fissure that divides it into 2 lobes, a superior and inferior. And then all these different colors, again, represent all the different segments. And there's about 10 segments in the right lung and 8 or 9 in the left lung. So you've got about a total of, say, 18 or 19 lung segments. And each one of those segments gets its own air from a segmental bronchi. There also is a little bit of difference in size or total capacity. The right lung is larger because the left lung has to make room for the heart. And then the height is different. The left lung is taller, or I should say the right lung is shorter because of the liver. So the liver occupies a lot of space on the right side of the body, and it pushes up on that right lung and makes that right lung a little bit shorter, but it does still have a larger capacity because it doesn't have to make as much room for the heart. All right, so those are some anatomical differences between the right and the left lung. What's interesting about this compartmentalization we see, right, with these different segments, is if we have to remove a part of a lung, the rest of the segments or the other lobe will function because they all get their own air supply. So for example, if there's a tumor, let's say a patient has a tumor in this segment here. Well, we can remove just this individual segment and all the other segments will still function. So you wouldn't have to remove a complete lobe or a complete lung. So it's very useful when it comes to removing parts of a lung due to lung cancer. All right, so now we're getting deep down towards the end. All right, so towards the end of the respiratory tract, we have what's called a lobule. So not a lobe, but a microscopic lobe, if you will. So notice where we are. This airway right here, all right, is a terminal bronchial. So it's very small, it's microscopic. We can see the muscle. So it's got this smooth muscle that controls the diameter, so it can bronchodilate or bronchoconstrict. As the air travels down, it's going to go from terminal bronchial to respiratory bronchial. And that's going to be the first area we can do gas exchange. So we can start to do gas exchange between the air in this alveolus and the pulmonary capillaries. And then eventually you get, if you kept going, right, you would go alveolar duct. A group of alveoli is called an alveolar sac. And then you can see these individual air sacs here called alveoli. All right. So the air eventually gets down to these little air sacs. All right. Now notice the blood flow. We've got a pulmonary artery branch. So this isn't the pulmonary artery. It's small. It's more like an arterial. I kind of wish this book would have called that a pulmonary arterial. That's deoxygenated, right? So that came from the right side of the heart. It's going pulmonary artery, pulmonary arterial, and then here are the pulmonary capillaries. Pulmonary capillaries coat the outside of all these alveoli. So now you're going to pick up the oxygen from the alveoli. You're going to get rid of the carbon dioxide. Now you are in pulmonary venules and then eventually pulmonary veins. So don't forget your pulmonary circulation, right? We're using deoxygenated blood in the arteries, goes eventually to the capillaries, becomes oxygenated, and now we'll bring it back to the heart in the pulmonary veins so it can enter the left atrium, all right? What else do we see here? Well, there's a lot, so you kind of have to group things. So we did the airflow, we did the blood flow. There's lymphatics, just like any organ. So these are just some lymphatic vessels with lymph nodes. We have some elastic fibers. We're going to learn that the lungs have to have some elasticity. All right, so when they fill up, they stretch, and then they can recoil, and that helps during exhalation of air. We see the pleural cavity. So here's this pleural cavity. So there's going to be a pressure in there. All right. This is the drawing basically of this. This is an actual tissue image of lung tissue showing all the little air sacs in there. And then it shows a little bit larger airway there called there's a bronchial right there. All right. So now we're going to look at a single alveolus over here. So we're taking one of these little air sacs and we're zooming in even more on it. So here's where the air is going to be. All right, so that's the air we just breathed all the way down into the alveolus. Coating the alveolus are capillaries. These are the pulmonary capillaries. So all we got to do is get the oxygen from in here to go into here, and the carbon dioxide to go from here into here. So that's called external respiration. Okay. Now, there are cells. Here we learn that there's three important cells. You've got type 1 cells. Those form the wall of the alveolus. So this alveolus has simple squamous cells forming the wall. All right. We also have to have cells known as type 2 alveolar cells. So what those cells are going to do, they show one right here, is produce a material called surfactants. Surfactants is basically this thin little liquid that coats the inside of the alveolus. And what surfactants do is they're going to disrupt surface tension. Surface tension is when you have moist surfaces due to water, right, that will stick. All right. We don't want this surface here to stick to this surface over here, because then this alveolus would be collapsed. So these cells, these type 2 alveolar cells, will produce this surfactant that prevents these little alveoli from collapsing in and getting stuck. All right. And why is this important? Well, one application is with premature babies. So the problem with surfactant is you don't need it until you're getting ready to breathe. So if you're born premature, these cells haven't produced the surfactants yet. So when these premature babies are born, these alveoli can collapse and be stuck. So they've manufactured artificial surfactants that can be given to premature babies to prevent this. All right. So you got the type 1 cells forming the wall of the alveolus. You've got the type 2 cells producing surfactant to prevent surface tension formation. And then you've got macrophages in here that we already know what a macrophage does. That's going to be part of your immune system. All right. All right, next step. We're taking this little box here and we're zooming in on it right here. So here's the alveolus. All right, so this here would represent this right here. Here's the capillary. All right, the pulmonary capillary. So this is the gas exchange we need to do. We need to get the oxygen from in here to diffuse through the type 1 cell, through the capillary wall, so the capillary endothelium, and then eventually get into the blood, find that red blood cell, and attach to hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide has to go the other way. So this has a name. It's called the respiratory membrane. The respiratory membrane is whatever oxygen and carbon dioxide have to diffuse through to get to where they're supposed to be. All right? This respiratory membrane is made up of 2 cells, right? The type 1 alveolar cell and an endothelial cell of the capillary, and then what we call the basement membranes in between. All right? So each of these cells have what's called a basement membrane. They fuse together. So now you've got basically just 2 flat cells that you have to diffuse through. The thinner the respiratory membrane, the easier it is to do gas exchange. If there's anything that makes this membrane thicker, all right, one condition that thickens the respiratory membrane is pulmonary edema. So what happens is fluid accumulates in here, and it thickens this distance, and it makes it much harder to do the gas exchange. All right, so pulmonary edema is not fluid in the alveoli, it's fluid in the respiratory membrane. That can make gas exchange more difficult. And then what typically is done is they're put on a diuretic, which helps to pull that fluid out of the lungs. All right, so there's a lot of things on this slide. I would take your time and kind of do it in groups, right? Remember, we did airflow first. How do we get air into the alveoli? Then we did blood flow. How do we get blood to the pulmonary capillaries? Then we zoomed in on one alveolus and looked at some cells. Then we zoomed in just on this respiratory membrane to better understand what oxygen has to diffuse through to get to the blood and what carbon dioxide has to diffuse through to get to the alveolus. All right? All right, so we're going to start the next video learning about what we call gas logs. This is kind of the start of the physiology of the respiratory tract.